And we are live, and it seems like everything is fine. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my channel, David Arhan. And today I have a very special guest, the Prudentialist. He does videos on geopolitics and something that will interest a lot of people in my audience that don't know him. He is also, like us, an Orthodox Christian, so he's a good friend of ours. He has done, in my personal opinion, from the videos that I've seen, a very sober takes on American politics and, in a sense, international politics, but mostly, American politics and culture. And he has a lot of valuable guests and book reviews on his channel. So, uh, but that's kind of how I know of him. I'd like him to kind of introduce himself, and just to make sure, is it fine to call you Prude or the
Yeah, it's perfectly
Prudentialist? Like,
fine. You can call me by
all
my
right,
baptismal name, Matthew. That works too.
Matthew. I'll call you that. That's. I think
Works
that's
better.
better. Yeah. So, kind of, what would you describe yourself as before we kind of get into this discussion?
Well, I guess for what I do on YouTube or on the internet, I do primarily write on international relations, both American culture and politics. I try to review books, and I do that mainly with my patrons and such. But I cover things from sort of a right of center, some like to call reactionary stance. But for me, at the end of the day, I would prefer to just focus on how do we promote a healthier culture and how do we ensure that our grandchildren live in a better world than we currently live in. Because I think it's safe to say, from anyone in America or outside of the United States, things are not on the proper track. And I'd like to find solutions, both personal and organizational, on how to fix those issues.
Yeah, definitely. That is something really, really important because I think, in my opinion, like globally speaking, there's a trend, there's a movement towards the wrong direction. And particularly in Western countries, the movement is much farther, right? Like here in Turkey, things aren't as bad as they are in America or in most other parts of Europe in terms of social cultural values. But that I can still see the shift, like the movement towards that direction here in this country, both even by Islamists, right? Like, for a great example I like to use is that the traditional Islamists are the ones pushing for immigration and refugees. And this is how we have, legally speaking, the real number is much higher, like more than 4 million Syrian refugees, right? So what happened in Europe and the United States in 2014, that's like happening on a much bigger scale right now. And we have the traditionalists to blame, right? So there's many different aspects, though, that I see happening all over the world. And the fact is, the Western world, in some ways, whatever they do, everyone else at some point follows suit, right? They kind of dictate the culture, especially the United States as the 1,000-year American empire and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's very important that a lot of us kind of ground ourselves in sensible views and how to look at the world. And sometimes some aspects of it has to be political because if you're not interested in politics, at some point politics will be interested in you. So I think that's what you do is pretty important work, from like what I will say.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Even if you hate politics or you just detest it or you don't participate, unfortunately, even if you want to be left alone, there are powers that be that don't want that. They will bother you, they will pester you. And the West is definitely the epicenter for a lot of those issues, whether it be immigration, the promotion of homosexual unions, Pride Month, etc. I happen to live in the capital hotbed of that in the United States, and inside the country, it's a battle that's still raging politically, and I think it kind of fits for what we're going to talk about today, which is the subject of what Christian nationalism is. How do Christians approach politics? Because out of all of the Western countries, the United States still has some of its highest, percentage of its population that still believe in God, that still believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. So there's, these internal disputes and fights that go on inside various, both Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant churches. And so, but Christian nationalism is more of a distinct Protestant thing happening in America, which is par for the course. I mean, America is, by all intents and purposes, and its character, its people, and its history, a Protestant country.
Yeah, and I will say, like, the way I see this discussion is that the discussion about Christian nationalism is certainly a Protestant phenomenon, but the kind of understanding, the concept is actually a concept that has existed, well, really since the beginning of time, I will say. Because one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of the term myself, I don't know what your take on it is, but I'm not a big fan personally of the term because I think it's kind of like calling yourself a pro-life Christian. There's no such thing as pro-life or pro-choice as Christian, as if you can have like these different varieties. There's just Christianity in this sense, where no, there's this official Christian view on church and state, on pro-life, on gender relations, etc., etc. It's like you don't call yourself a patriarchal Christian. It's like a Christ
It's
believing
kind of
Christian.
built into the formula there, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So on this topic, before we talk about Christian nationalism, what is kind of the definition of Christian nationalism because the way I understand it, and I use the definition inspiring philosophy uses, Christian values and doctrines shall have power over the state and culture, and the nation or culture shall be defined by aspects within Christianity, and the government shall be active in enforcing this. Would you say this is a good definition of
I would say
what it is?
so. I mean, when talking to people that call themselves Christian nationalists or advocate for it, for instance, I'm mutuals with both of the Wolfs, William, as well as Stephen Wolf, the guys that are promoting Christian nationalism. One of them's a Presbyterian, one of them's a Baptist. I mean, there are others that are more evangelical Christians, like Andrew Isker, Andrew Torba. What they really seem to be advocating for is to, for starters, remove the sort of progressive or leftism or wokeism, whatever term you want to call, outside of their own house. They want to sort of, take that out of the temple, so to speak. And at the same time, they want to reorient the United States to what it was historically, where, at its founding, there were state churches for the colonies, there were blasphemy laws, there were things that were more explicitly pro-Christian. And so, reading stuff from the Wolves, reading stuff from Isker, it seems to be, Protestant, little o, traditional orthodoxy, for the United States, and for that to be sort of the cultural mainstay of America, and that the sort of secularized division of church and state as we know it has been a disaster, and that needs to be corrected. And that seems to me what they're on about. And to have Christian values and the doctrines and dogmas of Christianity sort of have power over the country would be miles above in terms of what we currently have right now in America. So I'm for it in its theory and concept and practice.
Yeah, and what would you say to people who argue that, well, the Christ kingdom is not of this world, so we shouldn't try to deal with politics. You see this especially from a lot of like liberal evangelicals, right?
Yeah, well, I think the big issue that comes with that, though, is that doesn't mean I should be silent. And I mean, for us as Orthodox Christians, we have a litany of saints that refuse to obey pagan laws or doctrines. I mean, numerous, I was just reading up on some of them earlier this week in prep for this. And I think about even Emperor Trajan's daughter, who decided not to participate in pagan worship and idolatry. The same kind of idolatry exists today. I'm not supposed to bow down and be happy for Pride Month or the right to murder babies in the womb. So I shouldn't obey that. Yes, Christ's kingdom is not of this world, but I still live here. And I don't think that when it comes for me to face the dread judgment seat of Christ, that he's going to be particularly happy with me that I sat on my thumbs and did nothing while, the faithful around me withered away into idolatry, Satanism, or any other kind of sinful deed. I mean, we're called to correct our brothers and to welcome them back in and to seek repentance. But, I see those that say, oh, well, we shouldn't do anything. Well, then, your faith is going to wither up and die, or it's going to be worn as a skin suit by the enemy. And I can't stand by and let that happen. I think as Christians, we're given, we are inheritors of the Great Commission. So I think that, telling people that there is an alternative to this, there is the way, which is Christ and his church, that matters. And I think saying that, oh, we should ignore it, or, oh, we should come up with some bizarre theology that isn't doctrinal, historical, or dogmatic, not for me. And I think that if they want to go with that line because they're opposed to it, or they think it's scary to actually live by their values, then I would seriously question their faith and authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it has this pacifist idea behind it. But I think the first criticism that I have in my mind when I hear this kind of a response is that it seems like this kind of like when applied Christologically, it seems like this monophysite idea where like the only thing that matters is the spirit, right? It's like the spiritual world and how you spiritually feel, but not in how you act in the physical world and in the world that you live in. Yes, Christ's kingdom is not of this world. Yes, we are sojourners, but it is still true that we have bodies here and we have relations here. We have things that actually are related to Christianity here. And other than that, it seems the main problem, the big problem, and I talk about this in my response video against inspiring philosophy. The main problem with this view against so-called Christian nationalism is that by this logic, you're supposed to say that, you know, all of these moral laws that we l- legislate and enforce should not be legislated and enforced because they're just applying Christian morality. Something as simple as stealing from someone. If you're a Christian and you believe all ethics and morality is sourced in God, in the goodness of God, and that these are reflected in the created order, then it's very natural that this idea of not stealing from people is a Christian moral value. So by saying that you're going to imprison, which is using force, someone who steals something from people, you're actually forcing Christian ethics and beliefs onto other people. And the fact is, every single person enforces their values on other groups of people, right? So the debate isn't, are we allowed to do that? The debate more so is okay, to what extent, right? Like, do we force everyone to live literally like Christ? Well, that seems implausible. But should we have laws where we can have order within society, and this order is based on the Christian order that God Himself established? So the kind of the Christian metaphysics behind it, and this is relevant to kind of what you mentioned, right? Like with the history of the saints, something the Byzantine Emperor John Tsimikas said is very important here, is that uh, the church is in charge of heavenly authority and the state is in charge of the bodily authority. So there's this kind of Christological view of the divine and human natures being united while still being distinct, right? For example, bishops are not canonically allowed to be heads of governments, and heads of governments aren't allowed to be, bishops or something like that, and vice versa. So there's a distinction, but there's also a harmony between the two. And so what we see in the separation of church and state is this separation of that harmony, which is, Christologically applying this. It's kind of like this Christological monophysitism or even Nestorianism, so to speak, where one aspect is trying to subsume the other. So I think as a Christian, it's actually impossible to kind of argue against at least this definition of Christian nationalism, which is having Christian ideals be enforced by the government. And before I let you on, thank you, Rigovich, for the £4 super chat. Appreciate it. Thank you for the support. And yeah, that's kind of the one that I
Yeah,
want to make.
I mean, the big deal is that a lot of people will say, "Oh, don't enforce your morality," or "You can't legislate it," and it's rather frustrating because obviously all forms of legislation or all lawmaking is an enforcement or a position on moral values. And if you're going to legislate and say, actually, no, in the United States, I mean, there were some places until the more recent Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade, there was, people that were pro, post-birth abortion, infanticide. And so that's a moral position that is, abhorrent to anyone that believes in the faith. And so obviously, we have this idea as sort of Americans, and I think that it comes from a lot of places. But I mean, there's this position of like, I do my thing, you do your thing, we're going to just peacefully separate. And it kind of comes to the very core culture of America's founding to, I'm just going to exit. I'm going to situate myself somewhere else, and that'll be the case. I mean, we have, Providence, Rhode Island. I mean, Rhode Island is, founded after Roger, Sherman or Roger Williams, one of the two, just gets kicked out. He's left out of one of his Protestant sects, and he's forced to establish, his own territory, his own state. And I mean, that's a very traditional notion in America that we'll go do our own separate things. But it's gotten to a point where we've separated ourselves so completely from doctrine or from faith that it raises the question, well, how do I live side by side with someone that is pro gay marriage, pro Satanism, pro baby murder, etc.? Like, you realize that it's something almost impossible to sort of govern people on any sort of unified aspect of faith, values, and most importantly, for Christian faith and ethics. And so we've gotten very fractured in that respect. And I mean, secondly, for us, it becomes really important to consider that, no establishment of a state church. There's no federal church. America was designed with in mind to not have the King of England, and to have it sort of wars that had happened with the English Civil War. They didn't want a repeat of that. But I mean, there were still state churches in the colonies and in the states when the American nation was founded. And so people kind of take that separation of church and state clause, and they take this very new notion. I mean, they're up until the 1960s in America, Bible verses and Bible classes were available in public education. There was public prayer at schools, and after litigation by atheists and very anti-Christian groups, that went away, unfortunately. And so we have a rather recent historiography of what does secularism mean, or what does separation of church and state mean, when its original context has been completely lost on most people. And those like Stephen Wolfe and others are trying to reintroduce the historical, meaning to that. However, I mean, with America in the way that it is, both as a federal quasi-constitutional government alongside its demographic problems, you have no one able to speak the same language towards one another, willingly speaking past one another. And so, you're in a position now in the United States that even if you're a non-Orthodox Christian, you're heterodox or whatever, I mean, martyrdom is back on the table for you. I mean, we saw that more recently with the shooting in Nashville, Tennessee earlier this year, where they went to a Christian school. And I've spoken to people who were there and they were shocked. But I think it's a firm reminder that in the West, if you're a Christian of any kind, that, that you do have to live up to your values. And that does mean up into the point of losing your mortal life. And so that's something that we have to deal with in the United States. But I mean, Christian nationalism, or just even having Christianity as the moral guiding principle, which is, the God man is the way, the light, and the truth, that would be a preferable alternative to what we've got going on here.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, with the example that you gave, right, what happened in Nashville, I mean, again, there's this kind of a lot of Christians. I will say Christians in name only in America have this like pacifist tendency, right? They just think that, we're called to just suffer bad things and not resist it. But Christ tells us, we should lay our lives down to our friends. We should defend the innocent, right? And part of defending the innocent is preventing things like this happening, right? And one thing I have in mind when I hear you speak about this is I might be a bit wrong. You might enlighten me on this topic, because obviously you're Americans. I kind of have less idea about this, but there used to be a period of time in America consistently where there was actually this harmony between kind of the different churches in the United States. Not complete, obviously, there was still persecution, etc., but kind of this harmony between at least mainline Christian religions, where America was trying to establish itself as this mere Christianity nation, where the main thing, it wasn't gonna enforce one aspect of it because of the practical circumstances, but rather be this mere Christianity nation. And that obviously changed over time, right? And there's this fight between that. But what would you kind of say about that? Do you think that's kind of the real inheritance of the United States, whether it's good or bad, objectively? Kind of this the United States has tried to become this mere Christianity nation. Is this kind of would you say that's the ultimate goal that we should strive, Christians in the United States should strive towards, or do you have a different take on this?
Well, it's not that we would all get along happily. I mean, early on in early on in American colonial history, I mean, if you were a professed Quaker in some places, they would outright just kill you in the streets. I mean, there's a long sort of bloodied history over differences in America. And I mean, of course, there has always been that sort of anti-Catholic attitude that had existed, for instance, in the Second Klan in Indiana. I mean, that was also a huge part of sort of that concern over JFK, and now the Biden, who calls himself a Catholic and name only, really. But it's a problem that's existed. But I think that there was this sort of push that, it was said, I think, by John Adams, right? This republic can be kept by an orderly, moral, virtuous, religious people of, particularly of a Christian doctrine or persuasion. Well, clearly we don't have that anymore. I think that there was that original intention that despite our differences, we could find a way to coexist as a people of a unified language, regardless of church differences. There is still that professed belief in Christ, and that we could find a way to make it work. Clearly, that has changed. Obviously, the United States has fallen short of that, but I think it does tell you that there was at the very beginning this sort of Protestant idea that we could be that shining city on the hill. They kind of took the city of God portion, right, from both from Scripture, but also from St. Augustine. And it's sort of, we've fallen short of it, obviously, but I can't help but find myself thinking that the United States was a much better place when Christianity was the primal focus and the driving animated force. Now, I mean, plenty of things have been done in Christ's name that he probably would not like to have happen throughout both American and Western and worldly history, anyways. But it was oriented in a way that it did acknowledge God in a way that wasn't, passive in name only, or just something that you said when you signed on to the oath of office or anything like that. But America is so fundamentally divorced from any real low church or high church tradition front and center of its government that we say that, oh, we're going to govern by X. We're going to say that we're going to live up to our Christian values. And for many people, the idea of Christian values is hatred or hating people or not wanting you to do X, Y, and Z. They have this very, what Murray Rothbard would call like modal libertarianism, where it's just like, I don't care what the government does, just let me smoke weed or whatever. And that's obviously been an awful trend for like the last 40 years. And something that whatever brings the end to that, I'm all for it. And for me, clearly that call is Christ. But that needs to be a focus. And I feel like I'm repeating myself in that way. But I feel like I need to, just because like for the United States, you need to go back to it.
Yeah, and you mentioned something important, right? This kind of like this libertarian understanding that a lot of Americans today have, like, just let me do my thing, right? And as someone who used to be of a similar persuasion, I will say that I used to be libertarian. Used to be, very key word. But I still have some sympathies to kind of that. Obviously, I'm very far from that. I'll say it openly. I am like, I don't talk too much about politics because it's like the current situation I have at this time. It's like it's not realistic, right? Like what I want, but I am a monarchist. Like that's what I will call myself. So it's not something that I still have love for, like this kind of view. But like a lot of like libertarian minded people in the United States have this idea that, or just let me do my own thing. And they think that once you kind of take the government out of the picture, they are able to do what they want. But we see in the United States, what actually provides for freedom is ironically the government itself, or at least the good use of government, right? So although I sympathize with a lot of like people of that persuasion, like the libertarian persuasion, where they don't want the government to kind of meddle in people's affairs, it's actually the government, the good usage of government, that allows for that freedom. Because like something as simple as private property, you can't have that without the government. It's impossible. You can't have it in an anarchist state, because then the private property will not be recognized. It will only be recognized by just one individual, right? Or like a lot of these other problems, or like groups of people who do not have much regard for the Western legal tradition, let's say, right? So this kind of gets into this idea of pacifism versus force. A lot of Christian people, unfortunately, have this idea of pacifism. They think that the usage of force is inherently evil. But from a very simple level, good and evil are spiritual realities. Evil is not a thing, it's a privation of good, right? But they are spiritual realities. And so they cannot be reduced to physical instances. But that's what these people think. But force is a physical instance, right? But it's a neutral, physical usage. It can be good or bad. If you have someone walking on the street and they're about to be hit by a car, you should be using force in order to save that person, right? I mean, that's kind of like, that's a good usage of that force within that context. What makes something good or bad is the internal disposition that the act itself reflects, right? So a lot of pacifists have this idea that we shouldn't resist against evil, but they will say that in a spiritual level, well, they should. If they don't, then they will be saying that you should become evil. I mean, at that stage, that's self-refuting. But even in the spiritual level, they say, okay, you should resist, but you can't resist physically because that's evil, even though it's a spiritual reality. Like, you kind of see the problem here. And I see a lot of Christians confuse these two aspects, like the spiritual reality and the physical reality. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that you have amongst a lot of Christians. Like, like it's not just Protestants, but it's also Roman Catholics, especially with Pope Francis, um, so-called Pope Francis, that, or even within the Orthodox Church, right? We have this kind of pacifistic understanding. And before I let you, I just want to thank Smordron for the 100 Norwegian krone donation. He says, considering not everyone has the competence to vote, should we abstain from partaking in elections if we think we're not educated enough, or should we just vote as a part of society? Um, well,
Well, it would
I
be
think
who it would,
we can answer that question, but do you
yeah.
have anything else to say to kind of what
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean,
some
like
of my thoughts?
pacifism has been I think just this idea that like we'll just take it and I think that the taking it and just providing the other cheek has sort of been the language that gets used from, of course, the Sermon on the Mount to accept whatever is done to us and to obey authorities. But I think about what's in, I think it's First Peter 2:15 that, if God wills it and if we do well, we can put silence to foolish men. And that sticks with me because like we're supposed to be doing and acting and living as Christians. I mean, for a lot of people, being a Christian is just this Sunday thing that you go to, and it's nothing more than that. It's not, as Saint Tikhon would say, we live in the church and we're just out in the world. Our life is there all the time. And for me, it just does illustrate that, it's either a Sunday culture or it's something that you go to on Easter and Christmas, while it's just been so desacralized and commercialized that it's lost all sort of religious or metaphysical or virtuous value. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of people just say, oh, well, we'll just pass by, we'll just do what I want to do, or they just treat it as a social club, not that you're there first primarily to do what Christ commands you, which of course we're commanded to be holy, which is an impossible task without Christ. And on top of that, we just simply say, okay, well, they're going to do their thing. As long as we're just left alone, we'll be fine. But as it's become increasingly clear, whether it's the FBI's Richmond office investigating traditional Catholics in America, or people that have protested on Christian grounds against, say, these awful pornographic images for sexual education in schools. If you protest, like, you're going to be arrested and you're going to be punished. And I think people are afraid of that. And so they'll act pacifistic, and I think in a lot of ways to represent either A, like genuine concern for their family, they have a livelihood, and B, that they don't want to, either out of cowardice or security or concerns like that, which I can understand in a lot of respects, especially if you're the breadwinner. But for a lot of younger people and a lot of people out in the world, I think that they just want to get by. They just want to ignore it. But I mean, and we see this a lot with Protestant denominations, whether it's the whole, I'm friends with this man, I've met him IRL, he's a good friend of mine. It's the Ryan Turnipseed saga inside the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, who took issue with their catechism and how it treated issues like, pedophilia or homosexuality. And, he's a young guy, he's younger than me. He's in his I don't even think he's 20 yet. And he's like protested against and has caused concerns. Like, you want that kind of courage. And you want the ability to say, actually, this is what's I believe to be right, moral, and true, and that Christ is the way. And that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, as for that guy's super chat, I mean, I think if you live in how it works traditionally, right, in democracy, although I'm not the world's biggest fan of it, it behooves you as a citizen to be informed. But if you're not informed, then yeah, I think it would be smart for you to probably not participate in that respect unless you know.
Oh, so you kind of like that will be your answer to this question, like
Yeah, like you should
participate?
inform yourself that you're behooved to do so.
Yeah. My take on this is, I think, as I said, like, if you're not interested in politics, it will be interested in you. So at some point, you're going to have to know what's going on. But I will agree with the idea that voting doesn't really change anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't really change anything in reality. What changes is human action. And the problem is, a lot of people take this, especially like a lot of enthusiastic people take this to the Fed post extreme, right? And the issue with that is that, like, if you take it to the super obvious extreme, you're going to alienate a lot of people who will support you otherwise, because they're going to think that you're immature and insane, and it's going to be really easy to kind of discredit, right, like what you're trying to do. Whereas I think it's, as you said, like, people who have a good presentation of themselves and a proper life and structure to what they do are a lot more, they're as powerful as they can be in actually enacting some kind of change. And a lot of people, I think way too big, right? They think we're going to have a movement and we're going to like get the base guy in the White House, or he's going to change everything, or we're going to have a base group of people that's going to convince a lot of people. But a lot of it really starts with your immediate surroundings, the people around you, your own life, and what you do. And some people might protest to this analogy, but I think it can be applied in a lot of ways. Like, you know how Saint Seraphim of Sorrow says, acquire the spirit of peace and thousands around you will be saved. I think this concept can apply to actually the political realm too, because if you become the figure that is to be emulated, then a lot of people will want to emulate you. And to their credit, I see a lot of like good stuff on this online, like people encouraging others to, for example, look after their own physical selves, look after their own mental health, for example, in a proper way, not like the libtard, um I gotta feel good, like validation nonsense.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the direction that's definitely very, very positive. Like, what's your take on this kind of, like, how would you see this?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with how you invoke Saint Seraphim of Seraph. He's also on the iconostasis at my church, so I see that every day from the kleros and when I sing in the choir. But on top of that, I think that there needs to be that emphasis that you do have to focus on the self. A lot of people think, and I think Twitter and all sort of the online and the media ecosystem really does help enculturate this idea that politics is this grand metaphysical meta narrative battle for the soul of the country. And the soul of the country starts with your own soul first, and if you don't focus on yourself and you don't get yourself right, no one's going to look at you as an example. I tell people all the time, when you go to bed at night and you turn that phone screen off and you see the reflection of yourself in that phone screen and you don't like what you see, like, you should focus on yourself, whether that be physical fitness, whether that be, sticking to your prayer rule and fasting. Those things do matter for a purpose. They're going to discipline you, and they're going to put you in a position where you can take on more responsibility. And if you're not standing up for yourself and you're not standing up for those that have been pushed around, then no one's going to look to you as an example. So when you say we should do X and we need to do it right now, no one's going to take you seriously, because they're like, well, look at you. You don't walk the walk. You can say all the stuff that you want, but you're not living a holy or spiritual life. You're not disciplined. You're a fat slob or whatever. No one wants to do that. And so I tell people all the time, if you don't know who your county commissioner is, or your local city council representative, and you don't know how to even talk or break bread with your neighbor, then you're not a good political actor, right, in my respects. Because if you can't say, hey, I have this issue, can we work together and resolve it? Or even, for instance, I work with a lot of people I live in a very rural part in Texas. Like, I live out in the country, and I work with a group of volunteer guys to clear the roads and to make sure that the roads are safe to drive on after a major storm or tornado hits. So, like, unless you're doing things like that, then you're just someone, pontificating, very empty. And I think that vain words, or just repeating, vain repetition, just, oh, this needs to be done, this needs to be done, this needs to be done, and you don't actually do anything, then to me that's kind of sinful, and you shouldn't be doing that.
You know what? The last thing we need is a Matthew Heimbach.
Yeah.
The last kind of a person we need is that kind of a person. Like, it's the embodiment of like a lot of things that you criticize. I will say, like, kind of this, like, a slob who doesn't look after himself, someone who's taken this like extreme view and just making sensibility look really bad, right? They're committing the same mistakes that people on the other extreme do when they like promote certain things. But the big difference is that the people who promote a lot of the degeneracies on the far left, they're getting support from the state. You're not getting support from anyone. The state is using you to prop up the people that you're supposed to stand against, right? And this is kind of I definitely agree with every single thing you say about, like, looking after yourself, like communicating with people. A couple of months ago, I went to the UK, and I met a group of people that they do the absolute best thing that they could do in order to enact a positive change in their country and for themselves and for the people around them. They actually do these spiritual things. They try to live together. They try to, look after themselves and sustain themselves, look after themselves bodily and spiritually, engage with people around them, have a community around a community of many different people around them. Whereas having this kind of purely offline understanding where you're just offline and you don't really engage with people around you, or you don't really have proper social skills, that is not going to help anyone, right? The most you're going to be able to do is you're going to make a couple of memes that's going to get 100 likes on Twitter, but that doesn't really benefit benefit anyone. And something that I want to know, I kind of missed this, but I also want to make a note of it right now, is there's this kind of metaphysical idea that a lot of people like presuppose unintentionally, a lot of people in the Protestant sphere, and even again Orthodox and Roman Catholic sphere, but kind of this like liberal pacifist crowd, where sometimes they will say things like, well, God transcends politics, right? God is not bound by certain political views, right? And they will use this to kind of persuade you away from caring about things like the pro-life movement and other such things. But when we speak about God, I mean, we do say that God transcends everything, right? Like politics, logic, etc. But in his activities, in the reflection of himself, right, in his divine energies in Orthodox theology, he at the same time manifests his presence, manifests, reflects his character, and logic is part of that. And certain moral views that are political, especially today, are part of that. So people kind of had this idea that, oh, you don't need to be either political view in order to be Orthodox or Christian. But I mean, in a sense, you kind of have to be. Like, you can't be a complete leftist and then say you're a Christian, because the whole idea is being against Christianity in many different ways. This doesn't mean that if you're right wing, you're a Christian, but it does mean that a lot of essential Christian views are in many ways right-wing views, in the sense that it is about maintaining Christian order in society, like proper moral order and relationship between people in society. So that's kind of the problem that I see with a lot of people who take this, again, pietistic spiritual view.
Yeah, and I think I always have to chuckle when they'll say things like, well, God transcends politics. Well, if that's really the case, then someone's going to have a wake up call when they reread Paul's epistle to the Romans and talk about all these things that are prescribed of what you are not supposed to do and how you are supposed to live your life. Sure, we can submit ourselves to the political authorities of the time, and that we should, focus on ourselves and make sure that we are living through Christ, but at the same time, right, we're not going to be committing, we're not going to be, being hypocrites. We're not going to be committing fornication. We're not going to be, sinful or acting like sodomites or anything like that. So the idea that we transcend politics, well, if that's the case, then that would be claiming very heretically that, God transcends and will just be totally okay with pride parades or all sorts of nasty things out there. And yeah, I can't in any way, shape, or form agree with that statement, other than to just say, oh, we're going to do this, and that's going to be fine because God will just, he'll forgive us or whatever. And there's no genuine repentance there. There's no nothing, etc. And that obviously isn't going to be the issue. And I mean, for Christians in the West and America, especially, like, there will, I think of, Father Seraphim Rose's, sort of dedication in the translation to Russia's catacomb stains, just today in Russia, tomorrow in America. Like, it doesn't matter what branch or denomination that you claim to be or whatever you are. Like, and in the United States, all three sort of, views of Christianity, the Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Protestants, they've all been attacked by whether the government, academia, or the media. I mean, for Orthodox in America, one doesn't need to look too far and scratch under the surface of Fordham University and their Orthodox Studies division. We see this already. The Atlantic has come after evangelicals. The federal government's gone after Catholics. I mean, you have to build, and you have to ensure that if things get worse, or my government decides something stupid, like they're going to go to war with another country, like, I hope you're planning ahead. And I mean, in my area, there's talks of starting like an Orthodox farmers cooperative for food security and things like that. You do need to build, because at the end of the day, if you've done nothing right, then that's like building your house on sand. You should have your faith in God, but you also need to have that firm foundation to prepare and to live out your faith as fully as humanly possible.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, what's the objective of the enemy, right? It's to destroy you bodily and spiritually. So what can you do to oppose that? Build yourself up bodily and spiritually. It really is that simple, as far as I can say about this. Other than that, um, with specifically the United States, I think this is kind of like a general question that I have, because I don't really concern myself with politics in the United States a lot anymore, because I just don't have the luxury to. But what would you say? There's two angles to this question. What would you say is like, what's your take on the general political state of the United States? The second angle is, what is your take on what people on our side, like right-wing people, are trying to do politically, like kind of like the good and the bad on both aspects? Like, what would you say is the case?
Oh man, that's like the $64,000 questions right there. Well, I mean, the United States in general is heading in this rather bizarre direction where, in the name of progress, or sort of this, egalitarian liberation gospel, that all things that built the country are now anathematized and are considered, say, racist or bigoted or whatever. And in doing so, it actually makes itself very weak. There's for instance, Republican presidential candidates, they'll talk about going to war with the cartels or in Mexico, but they don't realize that would consider flying like drones over Southern California and all the border states, because it's that bad. At the same time, there's lip service is paid to these values, these foundational concepts, including Christian ones. That, again, it's only lip service. It's all in vain. And there are people that will swear when they'll do their oaths to enter Congress, and they'll put their hand over a Superman comic. They don't really care about the Bible anymore. Foolish man has said in his heart, there is no God. And so that puts it in a very complicated place, where there is sort of that Bertrand de Juvenel concept of the high, low versus the middle. So you've got a rather rich and wealthy establishment of politicians, academics, businessmen that do work with political patronage, voting, entitlement, etc. And it kind of goes against the middle, which are predominantly sort of the white church-going people that tend to vote Republican in this country. That's why, like, the Christian nationalism thing, like, yes, there have been plenty of people in different countries, societies, civilizations that are of different backgrounds that have gotten together under the church. But that's when the church had way more authority and way more power over the king, when you had people like St. Ambrose telling the emperor you can't receive communion. That doesn't exist anymore. There's no one with that kind of power or authority in the United States. And so until that comes back, the idea that they're gonna look at Christian nationalism through a very ethnic lens in America. That's unfortunately the way that it's going to be. For better or for worse, like, those are the ones that are spearheading it. And I think Stephen Wolfe made a point when he asked, like, outside of white evangelicals, who's defending against all the issues of gay rights, abortion, etc. And when you poll them consistently, I mean, even Orthodox Christians in America, they're more moving towards the right. I think it has a lot to do with conversion, but there's still issues there. So yeah, like, there's going to be an ethnic lens when it comes to talking about Christianity, because really white Protestants are the only ones that still confess anything and still go to church. The rest has kind of got its problems.
But Matthew, people online told me that Islam is based and will save Western civilization.
Well, I feel bad for those who say that, because in the United States of America, Muslims are more likely to accept sodomy than, like, white evangelicals are. The nature of my government, the nature of my government and its pernicious empire is that it's more effective at turning, IT workers into transgender people and Muslims into homosexual lovers than they are anything else. So if Islam is going to save the West, I think it would have done it already by the number of, Muslim migrants, legal and illegal, that have come into Europe. So yeah, I'm sure it will, but I don't know where. Good luck with that.
I mean, I mean, as I said at the start of the stream, I live in Turkey. The political system is heavily, like, traditional Sunni Islam centered, right? The Erdogan himself is advocating for a lot of moral principles and ideals, and it's that government. It's that government that allowed for tons of millions of refugees to come into the country. Like you go to Taksim, right, one of the big centers in Istanbul. I'll be honest. It's first of all, it's full of people, right? Like it's full of people. While like, and it's like it's a very long road. Like you're walking, it's full of people. There's not a single Turkish person, not a single one. It's full of people, people from Gulf countries, people from Southeast Asian countries, and people obviously from Arabic countries. Right? It's full of those people, and like a lot. I see this idea where people think that Islam is going to save the West, and it's very strange because they just look at some videos of like based Muslim guys, but even those people, I mean, they're against the traditional understanding of marriage. They don't believe in marriage because they believe that you can have four wives just as much as you can have just one wife. Like they're of the same value. Whereas in Christianity, marriage is definitionally one man and one woman. Whereas in the Islamic view, it's basically a government contract at the end of the day, given some religious quoting. And this is precisely why a lot of these people who come to the United States, come to the West, in fact, as you said, like they become Westified. They don't Islamify the West. It's the West that Westifies Islam at the end of the day. And one of the things that, as you stated, it's very true. It is the white evangelicals, for the most part, that is standing against a lot of this kind of radical change in the United States. And when I see, like, as someone who's an outsider, when I see the Republicans act like they completely ignore that, it's really sad, but it also makes sense because they're funded by millionaires as billionaires, right? But one thing that Erdogan and his party does in Turkey, that they do this really well, is that they financially and infrastructurally support their areas, right? Like there's the cities where they get the most votes, their constituents, right? They support them very explicitly and very clearly. Like if you vote for them, like they're going to stand by you. Actually, like they will actually stand by you. So a lot of like the pro Erdogan like cities have much better infrastructure than the liberal cities, right? So that's like an actual thing. But you know, Republicans, they don't do that. They're trying to help everyone. They're trying to do something that's in a sense noble, right? They're trying to be impartial, but that's not how politics works. And I think that will be the big mistake that a lot of people in the base right does, where in the name of trying to be impartial, trying to help the enemy too much, I think, is a very unwise move. And that's something that I see at times as someone who's an outside observer. Like, would you agree with this kind of thing, or do you think like what I'm saying is immoral? Really dumb.
No,
Like,
no. I think it's for those who aren't in the United States. I think what you kind of just described in your own in Turkey is kind of just sort of something you see with the nature of power. Is that you have political patronage, you say the right things, and you make sure that you offer jobs or handouts or sinecures or things like that to the people that you want to support you, and that's how you accumulate power. That's how you accumulate wealth. It's a very old political tradition, not just in the United States, but really throughout the Western world, at least, or those that have had exposure to maybe the West or certain persons and ideas in it. But I think that that's a very true thing, because like when you see how Democrats in the United States act, it is very much about having high concentration urban centers of power. And unless you're like living in some place like outside of Dearborn, Michigan, where there's like a Muslim majority city council, like you're not going to have like a really large number of traditionalists of that particular faith or idea. I mean, the same though exists in Christianity as well. Like we've gotten particularly soft in that respect in the U.S. I mean, lip service is paid to Christianity, but you're not going to see anyone govern like a Christian. You're not going to see even non-government people, right? You're not going to see the average person trying to ban things or to make sure that in their town or in their neighborhood, those things are not, present. So I think that, the big problem that anyone sort of on the right has is building effective patronage networks that you and your friends can run a town, or that you and your friends can have your values being exerted in some places. Now, to kind of go back to the sort of the topic of what we've been discussing, that concept of Christian nationalism, they kind of want that to be in place. The question becomes, do you have the patronage network to do it? In the United States, not so much. It's currently in the process of being built. But that also means as you build things that exist as a counterculture, exist as a alternative to what the government provides or what the mainstream zeitgeist is, which is some sort of progressive secular liberalism, which is some sort of Christian heresy, then they're going to be attacked by law enforcement. They'll be attacked with economic pressures and the IRS and etc. So there's a heavier price to pay for living by your beliefs. But again, no one said that living according to Christ is easy. If this were an easy religion, everyone would do it. But many are called, but few were chosen.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And a super chat I got that is very relevant, I think. NG Benji, thank you for the $5 Canadian super chat. He asks, slightly off topic, but thoughts on right wingers who discourage college level education in favor of trades. I'll answer this very shortly. The way I see it, trying to discourage right wingers from higher education is a very bad idea. You actually want people of that belief to be part of higher education. Let me give you one example. He's not like a political person, but Dr. David Bradshaw, for example, who I'll have him on my channel. I'm not saying he's right wing or left wing, anything like that, but he is certainly a very traditional Orthodox Christian. And he has done excellent work on traditional Orthodox Christian beliefs, like when it comes to metaphysics, when it comes to sexual ethics, like a lot of different really good stuff. If he believed in this dumb meme of, oh, don't go to college, just do trades. I'm not trying to argue against, trades are good. They're a good way of making money, especially today. But you're not dumb for doing, trades. It's just that if people had disposition for intellectual stuff and they're right wing, we should want that, right? That's exactly the kind of people that we want to have, rising up those ranks, so that they can represent proper beliefs in a very professional and academic way, as the zeitgeist that they live allows them. I said I was going to give a short summary, but that kind of ended up being wrong. But what's your take on this question?
Yeah, I feel like it depends on your view of there's a lot of people that will say it, I think, because they're big on the idea of collapse. They're like, oh, everything's going to go bad, or the government's going to stop doing its services or whatever, so you need to learn all these trades and how to do it. That way you can survive this sort of post-apocalypse, which on one hand I can definitely understand, because the competency crisis is getting worse in this country, in the United States. But on the other hand, there are still going to be centers of power. You still want to get a higher education for engineering, biology, medical stuff, all that sort of stuff, because the world does not live by plumbers alone, just as man does not live by bread alone. So you're going to want doctors, engineers, lawyers, people whose skills are manageable. I think that a lot of it is sort of this strange anti-intellectualism that exists on the right, because they're like, oh, college makes people liberals, we have to be anti-college. No, yes, there's a lot of progressive indoctrination at universities. I got 2 college degrees. I'm not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. I like to think that you can make it too. So really, I mean, if you want to be a tradesman, understand what that comes with. A good friend of mine at my parish is a mason, and my choir director is an electrician. I'm surrounded by blue collar people, but I work in a white collar job. You kind of need everything to do what's necessary in society. So if you feel called to do it, then yeah, by all means go into the trades. But that does not mean under any circumstances we should throw out the college education baby with the proverbial, academic bathwater.
Yeah, exactly. I think if you're going to be talking about having Christian nationalism be kind of actualized, if it's let's say it's the aim is to have it be part of X country, the steps towards it starts from academics, and whether you like it or not. It's and the fact that academia is completely in many ways subverted just makes it more difficult, but it still also makes you can see the case of it, right? I mean, the fact that academia is subverted is precisely the reason why a lot of research that vindicate a lot of like right-wing beliefs are now being suppressed because academia has been allowed to be taken over, right? Now imagine if it wasn't allowed to be taken over. Will those uh, arguments be suppressed? Probably not. It will be much more difficult to suppress them. So I don't think it's something that is completely dependent on the government or the culture, but something that it's part of, as we kind of discussed, it's about patronage to your own base. And this is a very important point. People really need to understand this. Like, you have to be at some level loyal to your own base. You can't kind of try to be this objective nice guy where you're trying to like shake hands with everyone. Some of the people you're trying to shake hands with literally straight up want you to be like, they don't just want you like gone. They want you unalived in the most painful way possible, because they, for some crazy reason, think that you're out there to like do the same to them. Whether that's like, and that's delusional, but that's the truth. And you can't really help people that think this way at the end of the day. And this is a massive mistake that a lot of people, I will say, like, the base right doesn't do this mistake a lot, but it's really the kind of like the more sensible normie right-wing people who like that. I guess I can kind of ask you that as well, like that, what was that guy, like that guy who sang about
Oh, the whole
coal
Oliver Anthony
miners?
thing or something like
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
it's
I,
like, yeah, yeah, it's like that, and everyone's like trying to do some patronage stuff about it, which is nice. But then he's like, he's like, oh, diversity is our strength. It's,
yeah, I
that.
noticed how and the accent dropped in the interview, and he's got like a big person that works in it has a marketing agency and all that. Like the idea that this was some authentic, protest song out of the middle of nowhere was clearly not the case. And I mean, like, conscious philosopher's point here is absolutely true. Like, you actually have to go, you have to be educated, you have to learn how to do these things, because if not, like, the left will continue to dominate academia as it has in the 1960s onward. I mean, remember when we talk about like freedom, like educational freedom, I know that's sort of like a conservative talking point now about letting conservatives speak on college campuses. Remember that educational freedom in the United States in the 1960s meant letting communists, talk in college. That's where it started, and that's what they were protesting under the guise of academic freedom. And that's how bad things had gotten in just a couple, like 2 generations. And so people really need to consider the fact that if you're going to engage politically, like, you really do need to be wearing your faith, your beliefs, your ideas on your shoulder or on your sleeve, because if not, like, they're going to continue to do so. And you need to be able to say, actually, no, I'm going to study this because I want to. It's important for us. We need someone to represent you, because, like, you don't want to be in a case in a court of law where the lawyer hates your guts ideologically, because if not, you may not get the world's best defense. And you want to have someone that believes in you. I mean, there are conservative law firms in America that one's for example, the Pacific Justice Institute. They did a lot of lawfare in California during COVID to make sure churches stayed open. And you want more guys like that. You want people that can make money and defend you and things like that. And you want to make sure that whoever's got your back has your values. And if you don't go to college, or if you don't do X, Y, and Z, then you're setting yourself up to fail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I saw a. Oh yeah. So I think this is kind of a decent question. Not this one, but the chat skipped. So okay, there we go. So I think this is a good question. How is this organization possible? The quick take I can give is like mainly political, not trying to make this like a religious unity, because that's exactly what you don't want, because that's ecumenism, and that's a pathway to liberalism, right? Which you're supposed to fight against. It seems to me it will be kind of like purely political, but with the understanding of some kind of mere Christianity. Like, well, how would you kind of look at
Well,
this
yeah.
question?
First of all, hi, Owen. Owen's a Catholic art teacher, I think, at a Catholic school, and he's a good
Okay.
guy. I like him. But I think that's sort of been. I mean, this was sort of the question that like Rod Dreher tried to answer with the Benedict option. He said in interviews that it's more about trying to get along with Protestants or Catholics that aren't Orthodox to try and pursue a more Christian understanding of the world. I think where Rod Dreher had failed was that you can't just retreat. And that's the huge problem, because even if you do retreat into the monasteries, fantastic. Well, as we kind of saw in the West, the monasteries will eventually be closed, the monks will be executed, and the monasteries will be used as barracks and kitchens for wars. I mean, it does have to be some kind of political action, but at the end of the day, like, I do know that for 90% of the Protestants I talk to and 90% of the Catholics I talk to, we're going to agree on the more important worldly political issues, which again are more, again, they're all going to be rooted as these a priori observations that we get from Christ and the Gospels and from the Old Testament. I can work with you on political issues. I think that for Christians in America, or really Christians in the West, period, there has to be that subtle acknowledgement that whatever comes after this, whatever our political goals are, you and I we're not going to be in communion with one another on an ecclesiastical level, but more importantly, we need to make sure that whatever persecution comes, that can we stop that from happening? I mean, if God wills that, any effort that we do is to lose and we have to endure our judgment, I mean, God's will be done. That's the case. But I think, we haven't done anything as Christians to put foolish men to silence or to, live our lives authentically as Christians in the West, come heck or high water, right? And so I think that for any sort of political answer to that question, it needs to be a positive vision. I would like a world where my grandchildren can sit under the vine and fig tree I plant, and they can sit under and not be afraid. And at the same time, I want a world where Catholic churches aren't being burned to the ground because of some fake political accusation like we saw in Canada last year. I want that to be the case in America too, where we're going to live separately, but at the least at the end of the day, I can run across the street to my neighbor and say, glory to Jesus Christ, and he responds, glory forever. It doesn't matter if he's a Presbyterian or not. That would be the positive vision I want. And that starts by acknowledging, like, listen, you and I are going to disagree on things, whether it's the Filioque way or the sacraments, or your soteriology is different than mine. But you and I both know that abortion is bad and that there are some really evil people running the government, and we need to offer an alternative to that.
Well, I mean, Filioque is the cause of all of the bad things that the funny thing about this joke is that I kind of there can actually be a good case for that, but I think that's for another day. But I think this gets to the principle that I kind of talked at the start, right? Everyone, including people who are against Christianity or against religion, agrees that enforcement of morals within a legal context is a given. It's gonna happen, right?
Yeah.
From like very simple stuff, right? So stealing is bad. You can't steal. If you steal, you're going to be, this is the punishment we will give you as the state, right? What is debated is the extent. So the way I look at the question about, how can people of different Christian persuasions kind of come together on this, I think this is why it can only be, in a purely political sense, although that sounds kind of paradoxical, because if there's this kind of political understanding of Christians that, we want certain Christian ideals to be enforced by the state, right? Like these kind of understanding about sexual ethics and things like that, right? That's where the debate then becomes, okay, to what extent? Okay, should there be one state religion, for example, in the United States? Well, that sounds impractical, right? And pretty much nearly everyone that is sensible, like politically, will look at that and says, yes, that sounds very difficult to accomplish at the very least at this stage. Like maybe it will become a problem once we actually, once this is actually established, for example, right? Theoretically speaking. So this kind of attests to the fact that a lot of politics is transitionary, right? So a lot of people have this understanding that in politics, there's this one end goal, and once you achieve it, game over, you win. But that's not how it works. It's a constant state of transition over what's occurring, both within the nation, within the person, and outside of the nation, right? Like internationally. And I think that's something a lot of people miss as well within these discussions, because at the end of the day, the greatest empire of all time, the Roman Empire, especially in its Christian form, also known as the Byzantine Empire, even that at some point fell, right? But what makes it great is the kind of culture and inheritance that it has. And that's what you want to establish within the transitionary periods, right? Like it transitioned into various different periods and it still remained. And if people want the West overall to remain, this is the mindset that people need to have, but the foundation is essentially going to be Christianity, because at the end of the day, Christianity is a religion of civilization. Aside from a couple of nations like China, Japan, right, that kind of had this civilizational culture, most civilizational cultures are European. That's just a fact, right? Italy and Greece is the civilization of civilizations, but you have France, Germany, England, right? Even Poland in a sense. Like all of these have some kind of civilizational culture within it because of this idea of Christendom, right? And that is the crucial piece that needs to be maintained in order to have order within the rest of the world. That's the way I see. That's why a lot of these pagan people who try to like return to paganism are completely missing the point, because you don't really have anything standing to return to from your own beliefs. But Christianity is a living like institution in many ways. Like you had the Orthodox Church. If you're a Roman Catholic, you had the Roman Catholic Church. So I will argue that's a decaying institution, but an institution nonetheless, right? You have the Protestant churches. Like these are actual living institutions that most other religions don't have, right? And that is something a lot of people have to have in mind when they consider politics in the West and how to live.
Yeah, no, I would agree that throughout the history of, say, empires and nations in the West and also in the East, in America as well, it's just that what has preserved the great epics of the past, what has advanced, scientific knowledge has been from the church. And, they'll talk about genetics or hereditarianism or things like that. Well, like Gregor Mendel was, if I recall correctly, he was like an Augustinian friar when he was, doing his, investigations and his studies. I mean, it's the same thing with monasteries preserving and copying ancient works from the pre-Christian era and age. I mean, these things were advances. Even more famously, right, in America, Werner von Braun had a belief in the divine from his own studies of science and advances. I mean, Christianity in the West and also in America and also in the East has been what has maintained its traditions and is what has survived it. Just sort of to be stereotypical, but I mean, like G.K. Chesterton had famously said, people say that Christianity is dead, but it's the only God that has found its way out of a tomb. And it will continue to survive and do so. America's had its periods of, great awakenings before, but I do fear that whatever great awakening we're in right now, it's heresy. And it's far more heretical than anything that the Orthodox Church may take up with Protestantism. It's even worse than that. And so I think that when it comes to it for us, I mean, Christianity will be here after you and I have left this mortal coil, and it'll be here long after our children have left this earth. I mean, our short transitory life is preparation for the eternal, but that doesn't mean that in the pursuit of being judged and deemed worthy to be counted in the book of life, that it's going, like, I'm not doing myself any favors for that if I'm witnessing the world around me go to hell in a handbasket, so to speak. I don't think that that's what God would want. And I don't think that throughout the history of the Orthodox Church and its saints that they're looking upon us in the cloud of witnesses like, yeah, we didn't die for this. We didn't get our crown of victory because we were pacifists. They declared Christ crucified and they preached it even to their death. And I think that we need to be doing the same. We're not living up to our end of the earthly bargain.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to like the various different heresies that are normalized. And one of the things that I do think is important to kind of discuss a lot of Christian, this is kind of why, like, yes, I do agree that there needs to be kind of this political understanding of various different Christians of traditional persuasion. But at the same time, it is important to understand, okay, what's the source of these things. And a lot of people really don't like that conversation very well. I guess it's understandably so, because no one wants to hear that many of the ideas that are causing the destruction of the West was actually caused by, for example, let's say Protestantism or Roman Catholicism. No one wants the finger to be pointed at them ultimately as if they caused this to happen. So I think, like, one of the issues, for example, of like the secularization, how did it begin? For example, in Russia, it came as an idea from the outside, right? It wasn't something that developed within Russia inherently. Now there are some traces of it, right? There are some traces of even feminism in, the Christian Roman Empire, right? St. Gregory the Theologian talks about this. He says, this idea of equality among the sexes, get this, ridiculous idea out of their heads. He's talking to the nobles, right? It was the aristocrats that was pushing this idea at the time. So there were traces of it, but what you see within the Orthodox civilizations, for example, is that you don't see a lot of the movements that happen in the West. And that part of that has to do with certain presuppositions that are foundational to those civilizations. So, for example, one of the reasons why secularism came very late to Russia is precisely because this kind of understanding of church and state, this harmonious union, was not modified. It wasn't changed into something else. Whereas this heresy of like the church and state relationships, and I know I'm going to make a lot of Roman Catholics not happy by saying this, but it's by the papal state, because in the papal state you have the fusion of these two things becoming one within the papacy. So the papacy is now the state and the church simultaneously, and in a sense basically the same thing. And Protestantism then comes as a dialectical opposition against it, and that's how you get secularism, right? So it's a problem that really arises from certain historical presuppositions that occurred in the West. And like we could talk about the political aspects, and I think there's a lot of really good things that are occurring that a lot of Protestants and Roman Catholics do. But at the same time, I think a lot of Protestants and Roman Catholics also kind of have to consider, okay, what are some of the presuppositions that at the very least occurred at some point in history that we accepted as correct that might actually not be for our benefit? Because the way I see it is that, a lot of like Republicans, like they're classical liberals, they just want to go back to the liberalism of the 60s, for example. Well, if you just go back to the liberalism of the 60s, then all you're going to do is you're just going to repeat the process of the 60s to the 2020s. You're not going to change anything. What you're supposed to change is the movement. Like, where are you moving to? Like, where are you trying to go to? And I guess it's kind of difficult because this is something that I specifically talk about, and I do like to get into these kind of like, how should I say, territories that a lot of people get really emotional about. I don't think you like it, but like, what would you say to kind of this? Like, do you think there should be kind of this? I don't want to use the term re-examination because that sounds very liberal, but this kind of like, how should I say? I guess
You may have to use
re-examination is
that
the
word.
best way. Yeah, I think. Do you think a re-examination of at least certain aspects of Catholicism and Protestantism will benefit the Protestants and Roman Catholics themselves in order to maintain a return to a Christian West? What would you say to this kind of suggestion?
Well, I think a lot of them are, and I can't speak for them personally. I can only base it on what they're reading and who they're citing. But when I read what they are putting out, I think they're already kind of doing that introspection, or at the very least, going back to the roots of their various confessions, the roots of various saints or reformers that they like to refer back to, and trying to get back to what was their original confessed form of the faith. And I have a lot of respect for that. I mean, I live in the United States of America. Like, I am a very tiny minority of Christian in the United States. There are more Orthodox Jews living in New York City right now than there are Orthodox Christians, at least the last I checked, right? So I think that at the end of the day, I don't see America in my lifetime or my children's lifetime. It's not going to turn into an Orthodox state. I'm not going to get an American patriarchate. Not yet. I pray that it does. But again, so for them to at least examine themselves and try and go back to their roots, I can respect and understand, because I think that it's a lot different from, say, in a secular or a purely political or philosophical standpoint to say, oh, I just want to go back to the 90s. Well, the 90s did get us to here. And I think that you made that point even going further to the 1960s. But I mean, the world of the 1960s, of course, was infinitely better in terms politically or culturally, and even in Christianity was a lot better than it is today. I can respect that desire to go back, but politics is also the art of what's possible, and that you have to acknowledge, well, what is feasible, what can I actually accomplish, and if that means that it has to be piecemeal or step by step, so be it. But to see our Catholic and our Protestant, separated brethren that they are, like, to at least examine themselves and say, well, hey, we kind of went off the rails here, or this one specific thinker got a lot of followers and they went off in this different direction. Maybe we need to go back to the confessions or whatever. Like, to me, that's perfectly fine, because even to go back to that in the United States would be infinitely better than what I currently have right now. So realistically, I'm okay with that. Am I going to see, an open debate about the ethics or the virtues of the founding of the country? You see that already in some places in conservative circles, and there are some that are Americans and have been here for generations and say, actually, maybe we have screwed up somewhere, and maybe it was the beginning and the founding of the country. But I don't know if we'll get there. I don't know if you'll get that full re-examination of, say, papal, the St. Thomas Aquinas, or the Thomas Aquinas view of, like, yeah, I know, yeah, I know.
You got caught, dude.
But
now you're gonna get a lot of, you're gonna get,
I'm sure
you're gonna get a lot of tweets and
I'm
videos attacking.
But, like,
I'm
if you
just
get
kidding.
the Thomas Aquinas view that there is no faith outside of the Roman Catholic Church, and his rants against the East, then I don't think you're going to get a re-examination of that anytime soon, at least in America. But I mean, maybe in the West, we kind of already saw that when they had their John Paul II write their whole Light of the East thing and what Catholics can learn from the Orthodox. But I don't see you getting that re-examination of, like, hey, maybe we screwed up with Luther, or maybe we screwed up with, all the other Augsburg Confession type. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, well, in terms of, I will say, and this is, the way I look at it, it's a disadvantage to the Roman Catholicism as a faith, but it's an advantage to Roman Catholicism as a institution in the world, of, like, their view towards other, what in their mind, other religions that are not fully true. Like, the way they look at Orthodox now is like, well, the Orthodox actually have Christ, they just need the Pope, which kind of sounds strange, but I mean, with the way they view our sacraments as fully valid, I think a lot of Roman Catholics, what I see from them is kind of this, like, they're kind of like mixing this, like, they try, I think they're kind of doing this re-examination that we kind of explained, where, as you said, like, their popes in history are doing part of this examination where they're looking at Roman Catholicism and how it looks at other religions, and they're kind of like taking a step back. The issue is they're taking a step back too far, because they're saying the same things to Islam, which is, you can't do. I'm sure Catholics themselves aren't happy about that either. But aside from that, I think, yeah, I can definitely, that will definitely be welcome, like, kind of like tracking back to what they originally were in some senses. Like, it will be pretty nice to have Anglicanism not have female bishops, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately, on a political sense. But if you don't have, yeah.
Well, like I said earlier, like, America at its core is still, like, a foundationally Protestant country. The majority of the country is still Protestant. Like, you're not, like, that, you're still going to have to work with them, right? Like, even if Orthodoxy in America got to, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, like, following it, like, you're still gonna have to work with those, foundational kinks in the, the system or whatever. Even if you find them like the Orthodox do, absolutely anathema. Like, okay, but again, politically speaking, I have to live with the reality that most of my political allies are going to be of some kind of Protestant confession or some kind of, like, doctrines of the Catholic Church. And there are plenty of people that I speak with and I work with on a regular basis that are Protestants and Catholics. And so, yeah, I think that for us in America, at least, regardless of your orthodoxy, you're going to have to work with people that don't confess the same thing you do. I mean, the benefit I see it is that for a lot of prominent political people, but also just a lot of young men in general, they have, since COVID, really flocked towards the Orthodox Church because, orthodoxy demands a challenge. It demands you to discipline and to humble yourself in ways that you don't get out of the, say, rock band on the stage, sort of Pentecostal Montanist kind of services that they have. And so People want to be challenged, people want to be disciplined, and the Orthodox Church provides that pathway. Whether in fasting or prayer rules, there's that rigorism in it that creates disciplined young men and women that will be, good Christians, that will, produce children and will, be good actors in their neighborhood and care for one another. You want that in any sort of political formula that you put out. And so I think that the benefit that Orthodoxy in America has is that not only is it the best kept secret, but additionally it offers, I think, a way for people to be disciplined religiously, spiritually, and physically. I mean, there are plenty of people I know that are big, gym goers that still abide by their prayer and fasting rules, and thank God for them. I think that, again, I think like we talked with Owen Zaleski in the chat, like you're going to have to deal with the political notion of it, not just the ecclesiastical. And again, the art of the possible tells me I'm going to have Protestant and Catholic allies.
Yeah, I think, and I think there can be kind of this understanding of, well, there's this similarity in some sense, this kind of like physical, like material, I don't want to use the term ecclesiality, but this physical material similarity or sameness in terms of certain essential beliefs that can kind of politically motivate the defense of these things with people that does not contradict your faith, right? Like without ending up being an ecumenist or being a liberal or anything like that. And that is a balance that a lot of people try to have, but I think that's a balance that is very possible to maintain. And that is something that, as you explained, a lot of people's both physical and spiritual development will be very key in establishing a future for ourselves and also for our children in the future. Because if we don't do it, then who will, right? At the end of the day. And I'm not much of like a, white pill only kind of a person or anything like that. But people really have to understand that having a goal in life and like a concrete goal in life and accomplishing that and like other goals as well alongside it is going to be very key in developing oneself. When you develop oneself, that's how you're truly fighting against the NWO. Because at the end of the day, again, as I said, what do they want to do? They want to destroy you physically and spiritually. So how do you compete against it? How do you fight that? You develop yourself bodily and spiritually. It's as simple as that. Other than that, I kind of want to, I think this will be a decent time to wrap up, because I think this excellent chat with you, I think a lot of your insights are pretty excellent, I will say. One of the things that I want to ask you specifically, like what are your projects or plans that you plan to do, or that you want to kind of highlight before we kind of end this discussion? If you
Well, sure. I mean, alongside what I do online, I mean, I try and keep my online and my real life very separate for real reasons. Like, you don't want a bunch of like lefty Antifa people trying to like barge into the liturgy or whatever on a Sunday because they find out where you live. But I mean, online, I am predominantly both a writer and a commentator on cultural things, both here in the United States, but also in regards to literature and culture. So my links will be down below in the description. If you're interested in that, by all means, follow along. I host two shows. I do one called Prudent Observations. I cover international relations and political affairs across the world. And then one called The Digital Archipelago, where my Catholic and Canadian co-host, Gio, is a jolly good fellow, where we talk about the news of the day and what's going on in the world. But alongside that, I mean, like plenty of Orthodox Christians in America, I am a convert. I sing in the choir in my church. I am an iconography student. I just try my best to balance that life of politics, but focusing on what matters first, which of course is to take up my cross and follow Christ. And so anytime I'm on the internet, I keep James 3 in the back of my head about how teachers or people who are offering instruction are judged more harshly. And so I think that that's something that all of us can keep in mind. And yeah, David, again, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. I'm a fan of your work. You're one of my favorite apologists, Orthodox guys on YouTube. So it's been a pleasure to chat.
Now my ego has gone through the roof when you have said that. I'm sorry, but now now I'm going to be an even more of an annoying person. No, I really appreciate the kind words. And one thing I want to say to the people watching this, and people who are watching this live, and the people who are watching the recording and listening to this, I am asking you for one favor. Please give me money Just kidding. Please support Matthew, the Prudentialist, my guest, on his medical costs. So he doesn't talk about this often, as I understand, but I'll put the link in the live chat. So he has a subscribe star that allows him to, like, if you don't, allows him to cover his medical issues
I
that he
use it to
has.
pay for my anti-rejection medication. I have insurance,
Yeah.
but that stuff's still expensive. So I have a job in real life. I am a wagey in sort of respects, but the money I make off of this stuff usually goes to keeping my out-of-pocket medical expenses affordable. And so, and if
Yeah.
it weren't for kidney failure and the transplant and everything like that, I probably would not have found my way to the Orthodox Church. And so I thank God for my sicknesses, much in the same way Saint Porphyrios did. So I can relate to thanking God for my illness in that respect.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of an excellent understanding of looking at like suffering and struggles that we all have as Christians. But again, if you want to see this man make more good content, and I'm not threatening you, it's just a fact. He's a busy man. He has things to do. You need to support him, and I'm telling you to do that. And if you want to give me money, you can do that too. But whatever. I'm just kidding. But other than that, yes, all of his links will be in the description below. You can go check them out. And as I said, Matthew, really appreciate you coming on here. And I'd love to talk to you, about some other topics sometimes. Maybe you can invite me. I'm
Sure.
shamelessly inviting myself to your show because, again, you gave me an ego boost, man. You made me feel very confident. And when I try to be jolly, I can be jolly sometimes. Maybe, I don't know. But again, thank you for coming here and thank you for watching this stream. And before I leave, Charisma Mysterion, thank you for the $5 super chat. Don't look forward or back, look up. I'll try my best. Well, now this is shown, so it's gonna look bad on my part. But any final words before you want to end the stream, Matthew?
Well, once again, just thank you for having me on. I don't really have a witty or coming conclusion for last words. I do like what how Craig Trulia finishes his shows. Fight to the death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you, for the wisdom of Sirach. And I think that's always the thing that we should go for, is fight for the truth. And the Lord God is truth, so fight for him, and he will be with us.
Amen. Thank you for watching this, and I'll see all of you in the next stream or perhaps video we'll see in the future. Goodbye and take care, everyone.